Hey guys, John here. Welcome back to the VPS Avenger 2 Master Tutorial course. This is video 4, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about wavetables, samples, granular synthesis, and spectral synthesis. So let's first start off with the wavetables. Let's click on Saw, and then down here on the left-hand side, let's go to Wavetables, let's go to Wavetables Hard, and then double-click on the first acid. We'll notice our editor looks different. We can still access the FFT editor if we want to via the tab view on the left-hand side. And we'll also notice that our keyboard layout has changed down over here, and we can always go back and toggle between the two with these two little buttons here on the bottom right. And then this center line here in the screen is basically determining how the wavetable will move through its waveforms. And we can see how it'll modulate this index knob once we press a key. We can disable this modulation if we want to by clicking here on the bottom left on the Enable Disable button. So once we disable this here, we can now freely move through the index via the knob itself. So let's enable this envelope again and see what else we can do with this. Inside the envelope editor, we can double click to add a point, and we can drag this around. And we can also change the curve of our lines here. If we go into the center between two different points, click and drag. And then we can always control click to set it back to its default. And then there's also some extra menus on the right click. We can delete these points. If we were selected on this here, we can delete that point. We can flip the envelope, we can reverse it, and we can reset the envelope back to its default state. If we don't want to move through the entire wavetable, we can adjust the strength knob to taste. So in other words, think of this as the modulation depth for the index control. So let's take a look at that real quick. The strength parameter can also be further controlled through note velocity with the slider on the right-hand side. So let's bring this knob down and bring the slider up all the way, and let's play a soft note. And now a hard one. We can also adjust the note velocity curve by clicking and dragging on this button right here at the top. Something important to keep in mind is that the wavetable will complete its cycle in the same amount of time regardless of where the strength knob is set. So let's take a closer look at how these speed parameters work with this knob down over here. So we're going to play kick drum and move the speed knob and see how that works. So the speed knob can be locked in straight time, triplets, and dotted time with these three buttons here. We can also use hertz if we deselect whichever one is selected, and now the speed knob, it goes all the way down from 0 to 20. To the left of the speed knob is the flip knob, and here we can flip our shape completely upside down if we'd like to. Now we can also do something similar if we right click here in the envelope view and flip the envelope here. However, with this knob we have all the values in between. To the left of flip, we have the phase knob. Now this sets the starting phase or position of the wavetable envelope. Let's take a look at that real quick. We can also see the modulation ring on the index also changes as we adjust the phase knob. So next up we have the smooth knob. Now this helps smooth out sharp transition inside the wavetable envelope. So if we had some points here like this that were very, very sharp, something kind of like that, let's actually add a couple more. Let's bring this guy down a little bit, and let's take a listen to something like this here. Maybe slow this down here. With the smooth knob, once we increase this here, it becomes much smoother. Below the index knob is the num waves knob, and this controls how many wave cycles we want to use out of the total waves inside the wavetable. As we adjust the knob, we notice on the bottom of the wavetable view how it's getting smaller or larger depending on which way we go. And if we hover our mouse over this knob and look in the tooltip view, it'll tell us exactly how many waves we are using. So in this case, 47, all the way at the top, this is going to be 64. So before we move on to the settings inside the editor window, we need to know about the two different modes above the index knob. So if we click this here, we have index smooth, and this will smoothly interpolate between the waves inside the wavetable. The other option is going to be index steppy, and this will move through the waves individually, wave by wave, and this is best noticed if we slow the speed down and take a close look at what's happening. So let's slow this down here. And we can see that this is smoothly interpolating between the waves. Now let's take a look at steppy. At the bottom right, we find a knob called Adapt, and we explained this in the last video when we talked about the freeform editor. Basically, this option will smooth the beginning and end of the waveform, and here we have a few different options. We have Adapt, which will center the start and end of the waveform. Then we have Zero, which will blend into zero crossing, and then Symmetry, which blends the left and the right half into each other. So let's take a quick look at how these three modes affect the waveform. So first, we're going to slow this down a little bit like that, and then the first one's going to be Adapt, and let's crank this knob a little bit here. And we have Zero. And then Symmetry. So now let's take a look at the options that we're going to find inside the Wavetable editor window. So as a recap, this enable switch on the left-hand side enables and disables the envelope that controls the index knob. So next up we have trigger, and this option is very important because it determines how the envelope will be triggered based on how we play our notes. So by default, this is going to be set to voice, and it's our only polyphonic option. This means that the index envelope will be triggered by each voice. So every time we play a key, the envelope will start from the beginning and each voice will get its own envelope. It's also important to know that the visualization will only show the last played notes, and this is best demonstrated if we really crank our release here for our amp and then slow down our speed a little bit. So listen to this low note here, and then to this high note. So we're going to notice that each note gets its own index envelope, and we can hear them both at the same time. So the next option that we have is called First. Now this option triggers the envelope with the first key that we play, and it will only re-trigger it once we let all the keys go and then we play another key. And this can be useful if we're making pads or chords or something like that, because adding notes won't re-trigger that envelope. Additional played notes will basically hop onto the envelope wherever it is at its cycle. So let's make something like that real quick. Let's add some unison. Slow this down to maybe 16. Bring our cutoff down, and a lot of release. Some reverb, and then some delay. So next up, we have one called Last, and every note played in the key zone will retrigger the envelope for all the voices. And then finally, at the very bottom, we have Global First. The first key played will trigger the envelope regardless if it's in its key zone or not. The next menu that we have is called the Mode, and by default, this is going to be on loop, so we hit a note, and it's going to loop the wavetable. Now we can click this down here and go to Ping Pong. And it plays it forwards and backwards, and then we have One Shot, which plays the wavetable once and then stops at the very end of its value. So next up, we have an option called Center Snap, and we turn this on, and this creates a helpful visual line in the center of our editor window. This is perfect when we're working with bipolar values. On the bottom right-hand side, we see something called Editor. If we change this from envelope, basically what we've been doing the whole time, to sequencer, now some interesting possibilities will show up. Our steps knob down here is going to be active. We can go all the way up to 16, and let's take a look at that. We can see that basically these little versions down here is basically representing what's going on up here. However, if we go down to, let's say 8, for example, we have a lot of different options with these individual steps. So for number 2, we can right-click this, and then we can go to Ping Pong. We can also go reverse. And we can always click and drag for some additional options if we want to make it like this. Maybe 5. Let's bring this up a little faster. So there's a lot of different cool modes that we can use here as well. So we can also go to the trigger mode, which is kind of interesting. It's similar to the normal, but you'll notice the more we scroll in, the lower it gets in the value. So depending on what you want to do, there's a lot of fun here. And what's also really cool is we can get this wavetable and modulate this. So example for the cutoff and bring this down, and this shape will now modulate the cutoff. We also have some more controls if we click this down here and go to the mod as well. So now we have another graph under this, which is basically a modulation control for the strength knob. So we can bring this down here, maybe bring this like that, give it a little bit of a curve, and kind of adjust these on the go. We can double click to add another point right there. And then let's take a look at how that sounds. And as well as we had over here for this mode, we have something similar as well for the pattern mode. So right now we've been looping this, although we can go to ping pong and kind of have it go forwards and then backwards. So down here at the bottom where our keyboard used to be, we have 3 different buttons up here. One's called norm, which is basically normalizing. We can also reverse. And then we have vocoder, which is actually pretty interesting because this changes the sound, forcing the waveforms to be symmetrical, and it also prevents clicks as well. And at the bottom here, we can fade in our wavetable if we'd like to, something kind of like this, and always adjust the curve as well, or we can fade it out like that as well. Really depends on what we want to do. And if there's something cool that we set up and want to save, we can always click these lines up here at the top, and then we can go and save the preset, or we can load something from this menu over there. Now let's take a look at how audio samples work inside Avenger. Let's click where it says saw on the left-hand side. Let's go to samples and then factory lead synth. And this first one here, this analog 70s lead 1. And we can already play some keys. Now we'll notice that we have a sample start location. Right here, it's going to be starting at the beginning on the left-hand side. Now we can move this if we put our mouse here and move this with our left mouse button. We can also use this dial here, or move this flag down here at the bottom, or also use the dial down here at the bottom. If we want our sample to start at a random spot, we can increase this random start here, and you'll see how it starts to highlight. So in the highlighted area is all the possibilities of where our note can land once we press a key. And all the way to the right, it's going to be randomness for the entire sample. We can always delay our sample if we'd like to, all the way up to 200 milliseconds. And similar to the other oscillators, we also have a knob for bit and sample reduction, or both at the same time. And they're going to be available in both sections, one up here at the top and then one down here at the bottom. On the bottom left-hand side, we have a knob called Shift. Now, this one's interesting because it shifts the samples up or down, but it retains the pitch and changes the texture of the sound. So let's take a listen to that real quick. To the right of the shift knob, we have key tracking, and this is going to be linked to the key tracking parameter up here in the oscillator window. And by default, this is going to be at 100%, and we'll play the notes as we expect them to be played. If we set this to 0%, every note on the keyboard will be the same pitch. We can also go to negative 100%, and this is essentially going to flip the keyboard upside down or invert the notes. So the low notes on the keyboard will play the high pitch notes, and the high pitch notes will play the low pitch notes. On the right of the sample editor, we have a gentle 6 dB per octave low and high pass filters, which is also going to be linked to the ones right up here at the top. Avenger allows us to stack or layer multiple samples to a maximum of 4 per oscillator. To layer a sample with another one, we have to click the plus in the oscillator section down over here. So let's click this plus here and let's navigate to factory piano or organ. And let's select this first one, this bell-rich piano, and double click that. So now we basically have both of these samples playing at the same time. So inside this oscillator section here, we can see these two different samples, and we can hide these by clicking this arrow if we'd like to, or we can click it again to show them. Now on the right-hand side, we can toggle through these different sounds. So this bell-rich piano, if we hit the right arrow, we can go through the next ones, or on the right-hand side, we have access to our volume control. And we can double click to default. We can also solo and mute these on the left-hand side. So we can solo this one here just to listen to it, or solo this one here. We can mute it. And if we want to get rid of one, we just click this X here and it's going to remove that one entirely. But let's go ahead and add that back here. So remember that plus here into the samples, down over here to piano, and then double click on the bell-rich piano. So now let's take a look at how we can edit these samples individually. So for example, let's say we want to take this bell-rich piano down 1 octave while retaining the pitch of our first sample. So what we got to do is click on the bell-rich piano, and then down here at the bottom, we're selected on global, but we need to select on slot 2 bell-rich piano, and now we have additional controls for this sample. So let's say we want to take this down an octave. All we got to do is drop this down by 12 semitones. Now we also have access for shift, what we spoke about earlier. We have our fine tuning control, and keep in mind this one does have a secondary function with right click, and it's going to be a random tuning. Then we have our volume and our panning. Now over here is pretty cool. We have a velocity zone and a key zone. So for example, let's click this key zone over here. Now once I play a note, we're right over here. So if we don't want this note to play the sample, we can bring this down. It's only once we play down here we're going to hear that piano. But anywhere above that, we won't hear that. So that's a cool zone right over there. And we also have a velocity zone. So let's say we only want this piano sound to be triggered once we hit a hard velocity note. So we need to bring this up. Let's maybe go for something up here like that. If we play soft notes, it's only going to be that lead. But if we hit hard notes, we're going to have that keyboard playing as well, or that piano playing as well. And on the right-hand side, we have key tracking. If you want to keep that on, we have the start offset, random offset, and delay. So now let's turn our focus to granular synthesis. Normally when we play back audio, we have one playhead and it plays the audio back to us, like how the sample oscillator works. Now, granular synthesis gives us lots of different playheads that we can play forwards, we can play backwards at different time lengths, at different pitches, and these are called grains. And it's a really, really cool process, really cool for pads as well. So let's take a look at how granular synthesis works inside Avenger. Let's open up our browser and navigate to the granular section. So let's click SAW, and then over here on the left-hand side where it says granular, let's load up granular factory vocals, and let's scroll down here until we find vocal loop 1 and double click to open that. So once we load this up here, we can start playing a key and listen to the sample.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels.
Now this big knob here on the right-hand side is going to be our position knob, and this is going to change where in the sample the playback starts. And we can see it change up here on the oscillator section. And we can also follow the tiny little red dot that we're going to be looking at a little bit later on in the video, but that's going to be almost a guideline for us. Below the position knob, we have a knob called density. Now, this knob determines how many grains or playheads are going to be generated. By default, this is set to about 100 grains per second, and we can go as low as 10 grains per second and as high as 200 grains per second. So let's take a listen to that.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever,
This is 10 grains
you and me together, you know
and 200.
how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And back to 10.
Better late.
And below that, we have a knob called grain size. So basically, how long are those grains allowed to live? By default, they're living for about 100 milliseconds, and their lifespan can be shortened to 25 milliseconds, or we can let them live as long as 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. So let's adjust both of these knobs and see how that changes our sound.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
So below this grain size knob, we have a drop-down list, and here's where we can change the grain envelope. This decides how the grains are going to be blended in and how they're going to be blended out. Now by default, this will be set to triangle, which will be the smoothest option with no clicking, and the manual defines these as the triangle, 50% blend in and 50% blend out, the smoothest setting with no clicks. Then we have trapezoid, and now this is near a square with a short fade in and fade out. Then we have ramp up, and this is a fade in with no fade out, and this might produce clicks. Then we have ramp up rounded, which is a rounded version with less clicks. Then we have ramp down, and this has no fade in, but it does have a fade out, and it might produce clicks as well. Then we have ramp down rounded, and this is the rounded version with less clicks. So let's take a listen to all these real quick and see how they sound. So we're going to start on triangle and go through the others.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And below this, we have the root note, and here's where you can set the root note of the sample. Next up, we have the random position knob. Now, this control determines a random starting position for the different grains. At 0%, all the grains are going to start from the main starting position, and at 100%, the grains can be spawned anywhere throughout the sample. So let's take a listen to see how that sounds.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And down here at the bottom, we can see all these little red dots, and they're going to be all over the place, which is showing us that those grains are starting all over the place. Next up, we have the random pitch. Now, this gives the different grains a slight different pitch here, so let's take a listen on how that sounds, and also look at the different grains at the bottom, how they're going to start spreading out vertically.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels.
So here we have the spread pan knob. Now this knob controls how the grains are spread throughout the stereo field. If we turn this knob to the right, the grains will alternate between the left and the right speaker. If we turn it to the left, the grains are randomly assigned throughout the stereo field, which is pretty sweet, so let's take a listen to that real quick.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And double click for default. And over here on the left hand side, we have this spread pitch. And this one's pretty interesting because it will spread the pitch in opposite directions in the left and the right speaker. Basically, turning this knob to the left brings down the left speaker by 1 octave and the right channel up by 1 octave and vice versa. So let's take a listen to that.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever, than head over heels. You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And then double click for default. The next knob determines in what direction the grains will be played. So at fully 100% or default value here, the grains will all be played forwards. At 50%, half the grains will play forwards and half will play backwards. And then at 0%, all the grains will play backwards. So for example, let's turn this all the way to the left, and you can see the timeline moves to the left, but you can see that the grains will play backwards.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever.
And here's forwards.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
And here is 50-50, so half forwards, half backwards.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
The center display is how we adjust our envelope, and the controls should be familiar to us at this point. Right-clicking will flip the envelope, you can reverse it, you can reset the envelope, you can also delete points if you right-click on a node. We can adjust the curvature with left mouse button, and we can scroll in and out with a scroll wheel. Now, down over here on the bottom, what we haven't talked about yet is speed, so right now it's 1 times.
You and me together.
Now we can click and drag this up to 2,
You and me together, you know how sad it feels.
or higher to 4.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever.
And we'll notice that this is tied to the speed knob down over here. As we move this, it moves down there as well. Now, right now we have a couple different modes. We have speed steps and then speed smooth. With steps, it's going to move in intervals.
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever feel.
However, if we go to smooth,
You and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever feels. You and me together,
it's basically going to be smoothing that speed.
you and me together, you know how sad it feels. Better late than ever feels.
And then again, we have flip over here, which is going to flip the envelope.
You and me, you
The strength knob here on the bottom left-hand side functions as the other ones in Avenger. In this case, the strength controls the depth of the position knob, also can be used with note velocity and curvature via this slider here and this button right over here. In the mode dropdown menu, we have a few different ways of how the envelope works, such as one shot, which plays the sample only one time, and then we have sustain, which adds a sustain point to the envelope, then we have loop, which loops the envelope, and finally we have ping pong, which plays the sample forwards and then backwards again. Now these modes also have RLS feature, which uses the release node as the envelope release point. Moving on to sync, we have quarter by default. We can click this drop-down menu and turn it to triplets if we'd like to, or we can turn it off entirely. And then we have the trigger mode again, so we have voice, first note, and last note, kind of like what we discussed earlier on in the video. And down here towards the bottom, we have 3 additional parameters. We have loop, which basically makes the sample loop over and over. Then we have cloud. So if this is enabled, the grains will retain their length regardless of pitch. If it's turned off, the grains will be faster when higher pitched. And then we have transient, and this adds a dry version of the original signal to the attack phase to emphasize the transients. And finally, let's look at the bottom waveform display for some additional parameters. So on the top left, we can adjust our start time. On the bottom right, we can adjust our end time. And then down here on the bottom left, we can adjust our grid size from 4 to 8 to 16 and to 32. In Avenger, we have a Spectral Oscillator. Now, this is somewhat similar to the Granular Oscillator and has some of the same controls, but this one works on a time-stretching FFT algorithm and has lots of different modes, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, let's load up a sample here. Let's click on Saw, and then down here under Spectral, let's click this guy, and then Factory 2, and let's select this metaphor pad, and let's take a listen. Already sounding pretty good and smooth. Now, the first thing that we should know about with this oscillator is this FFT mode section down over here. So by default, this is going to say song/mix. Now, if we click this, we have quite a few different options to choose from. So we have drum lo-fi, plucked, piano guitar, song mix, drone, pad smear, and then simple. So basically, depending on the type of sound that we have, we want to pick the appropriate algorithm here because they're going to be specially tailored for that type of sound. So let's select on pad because this is going to be a pad. And now let's take a listen. All right, so the first knob that we should talk about is going to be this magnitude decay. And as we increase this more and more, we're going to get more of a reverb type of effect. Moving on, we have a tone shifter. Now, this is really cool. This knob is a dual function knob. So the left click, think of that as a dry wet, and then the right click is going to be how much of a tone shift we want to have. So by default, this is going to be plus 12 semitones or an octave. So take a listen as we increase this knob via left clicking and mix the original signal with the tone shifted signal up by 1 octave. We can also go to a maximum of 24, so 2 octaves. Now let's take a listen to that. And double right click to set that back to its default. Next up, we have this random phase. Now, this is really cool if we disable this envelope here and take a listen and find a cool spot to put this position up. And then let's increase this random phase. And we can try it on some different algorithms as well. So let's take a look at drone. And we can even see here on the spectrum how different it is, how it kind of makes things a little bit more, I guess, smooth or cloudy. See how straight these lines are here? And once we turn this, so I've loaded up a piano sample here, and we're going to take a look at the spectral expander. Now, the piano sounds like this originally. Now, what's cool about the spectral expander is we can basically enhance things on a spectrum basis. So this kind of has a lot of the similar controls as a compressor would have. We have a threshold, we have an attack, and a release knob. And this is going to be, think of it as our amount knob. So for example, we're going to be in additive mode right now. And let's set our threshold to begin with. Maybe a little bit lower. And watch, once we increase this knob, we can see that the stuff below our threshold starts to get pushed. And we also have a subtractive mode. So now in this case, we have a vocoder loop loaded up, and this is a cool spot where we can use the spectral expander for more sound design kind of things or more sound effects. So for example, this is going to sound like this originally. We can make this sound really cool, so let's add a little bit of a release here to our envelope. Let's add some reverb, and then let's add some delay as well. Now let's start messing around with the knob here. Maybe let's bring our threshold down just a little bit and see what this sounds like. And here's another example where I think this would be really cool. So we have a full EDM loop 2 playing. Now we're going to play this with some drums and kind of subtly move this expander here to kind of just give it a little bit of texture and a little bit of something more interesting. Yeah, so that can be used very creatively. It's a really cool feature, and I highly recommend to not overlook it. All right, guys, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to be talking about single loops and multi-loops, which is a really, really cool feature inside Avenger 2. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next video.